So I asked him about the pen flip, and he did a good, I'm going to say he did about 25 to 30 minutes about the pen flip. So he gave me,
Wow.
I know, and I was like, oh my God, this is Dave Hodge. He's one of my favorites too. But tell me about working with Dave Hodge and being there that day, and any insight you can share on that would be just cool for me.
Well, of course, it's in the fog of time now. So, and as science and research has proven, everybody has different memories of things that they see, even though they all saw the identical thing. And you can ask people literally minutes after they've seen it, and everybody will have a slightly different interpretation. Here is mine. One of the jobs was to do out of town scores, watch the out of town game for Dave. And you see, this is, analog technology, 1980s. So it was a big deal for Hockey Night in Canada to have a satellite feed of an out of town game. On this occasion, it was the Montreal game. I want to say Montreal, Philadelphia, but I could be wrong. And I would watch that game. And when there was a goal scored, I'd say, Dave, there was a goal scored in the Montreal game. And he'd sort of turn around from what he was doing and take a look at it. And he'd say, what happened? And I'd say, Chelios knocked it down at the blue line, moved it up, and it was a quick shot by Naslund, top corner. So then when there was a pause, Bob Cole would go, and now let's go down and hear what Dave Hodge is watching the other game. Dave? And he'd go, second period, Montreal, the puck comes back, Chelios over to Naslund, he scores, Canadians are up 2-1, and they play it back. So that was my job that night. Well, earlier in the day, the Brier had been running, and the curling championship, and Dave and Bob Cole were both big curling fans, and they were sitting in this little sort of anteroom by the studio at the old Maple Leaf Gardens watching, it was called the client room, and it had TVs in it, and they were sitting and they were watching CBC Sports, watching the Brier. And CBC did what back then was a classic CBC thing, where local news was sacrosanct. So at 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock, it didn't matter what was on, you dumped out of it to get to the news. That was the way it was. So they dumped out of, as I recall, extra ends of the Brier to go to local news.
Yeah.
And I remember Dave and Bob sitting in there. And keep in mind, I was a runner, so it's not like I was sitting in with, hey, guy, what do you think of that? Like, I was, yes, Mr. Hodge, I'll get you a coffee. He was at Double Cream. So they were both apoplectic. Like, what the hell is this? This is bullshit. How can they? One of those. So fast forward to that night. We were watching the game. As usually happened, the Toronto game would end earlier, and I don't know why that was. But so they were late in this Montreal game, and let's say, for sake of argument, the game ended at 7 minutes to 11 when you have to be off. And they would throw to the other game. And the producer was a guy named Doug Sellers, who was a great young Hockey Night in Canada producer, left, went to work for Fox, and unfortunately he died a few years back. But he was up and coming, very, very good producer, producing the game. So because I was doing that job, I had a headset on, so I could hear the truck, the production truck, and of course Dave was pretty much right beside me. And I'm trying to remember, the game ended. We did out-of-town scores through to break, and then in break, in a situation like that, is typically when the producer will, okay, here's what we're doing. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. You tell your host, and it's your host's job to execute the plan. And what the plan was, Dave, we're going to come back out of break. Want you to throw to extra coverage of the Montreal-Philadelphia game, if that's what it was. And then, we're going to stay with that as long as we can. And it was a close game. It was late in the game. It was 4-3, 3-2, something like that. And Dave, one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with, flagged it up and said, if they tie it, we better stay. Because this network has already dumped out of the Brier earlier today. And the producer has absolutely no control over this at all, right? It's the network that decides it.
Right.
So they go to break, they come back, and we now take you to extended coverage. Boom. So we go to the game. The game's going on. Sure enough, somebody ties it. So it's tied. Now we're going to go to overtime. Okay, so then they throw to break there. We come back on camera. The producer says something along the lines, okay, Dave, we're going to run through the out-of-town scores, and then you got to come back on camera and say, basically apologize that we can't show you the end of the game as a result of network commitments and yada, yada. So Dave said something along the lines, again, as my recollection is, don't put me on camera and make me do that. I'm not going to come on and tell people we're not showing the end of this game after we've already done this to curling fans. The producer plays his card. Producer's in charge, as he should be. Hosts host, producers produce. That has to be the pecking order. And the producer says, you're the host of the show. Here's what we're going to do. We're doing out-of-town scores. You come on and wrap the show up. Like, that's the way it is. So we go through. He comes on. We go through the out-of-town scores. He comes back on camera, obviously disgusted. The whole bit where he looked off camera and said, are we going to that game? Are we going back to the game? Was 100%, to my recollection, theatrical. He knew exactly what we were doing. He'd been told a couple of times, and and the only guy off camera when he looked off camera would have been the floor director, who wouldn't have had a clue what we were going to do.
Right.
So then he, looked back and said, no, apparently we're not going to that game, and so we will have to wait and see who won the game and who's responsible for the way we do things around here. Flipped the pen in the air, and that was the end of the show. He got up, walked over, grabbed his coat, and left. And that was the last thing he ever did for Hockey Night in Canada. That is my recollection. Apologies, Dave, if I remembered it differently than you, but that was my recollection.